Good morning. How's everyone doing? Cool, cool. So, as remind me of your name, as Brian, Ben, Ben, as Ben just introduced me with, I'm gonna really focus on microdosing today. I'm gonna focus on both the individual experience of microdosing, so basically how has microdosing impacted people from a clinical perspective, but also a general well-being perspective. And then I will transition into the larger potential socioeconomic and cultural impacts of microdosing. And really, what I'm going to lay out for you is my personal story with microdosing, how that impacted my path in starting the third wave, and then what our vision is for the next 3 to 5 to 10 years in terms of how microdosing can be used as a touch point to basically further familiarize a mainstream population with psychedelic substances and general well-being. So that will be the kind of overarching perspective. And I'm going to adjust some things real quick. Okay, so microdosing, right? So who here is familiar with microdosing? You've like heard about microdosing, you know something about it, you kind of have the basics down. Okay, so that's most of you. How many of you have tried microdosing yourself? Great. And keep your hands up if you tried microdosing in a very intentional, purpose-driven kind of protocol perspective. Okay, so maybe about 10% of you. And so that's really the key to microdosing that isn't spoken about a lot. It is really just as high doses are about set and setting and intention. That's also an important aspect of microdosing as well. And you know, the way that I came to microdosing was in June 2015. So I first did LSD like 8 years ago, right? I was 19. I grew up in Michigan, which is fairly traditional and conservative. And basically, throughout my early adolescence and childhood, there was this impression that something was wrong with me. So I often took on a lot of shame, for example, for smoking cannabis when I was 16, for thinking differently. I kind of had this outsider perspective. And when I first dropped acid when I was 19, basically I had this tremendous insight of, oh wait, the issue isn't with me so much. The issue is with our system at large, society, culture, and the things that we value. And so when I came to that recognition at the age of 19, basically what I did is I made a commitment to pursue a more unconventional path to look at how we could best change that culture and system so that it transitioned from basically late-stage capitalism, which is about extracting value from humans, and helping to transition into something that's a much more collaborative socioeconomic system, which focuses on regenerative economics, revitalization, with an initial focus on the individual. And with that focus on the individual, it's how do we help people pursue optimal well-being so that they're in a state of mind to then go out and change the systems at large from a point of clarity, from a point of intention, and from a very practical perspective. So that led me to a number of different things, but basically what I did is I ended up in Budapest in mid-2015. And that's when I first started microdosing. And at the time, I was in the midst of a couple entrepreneurial projects. So I had started my own website about how to teach English as a foreign language because I had done that for Turkey in a year after graduating from school. And I wanted to create a website that then allowed me the freedom and the independence to go and basically pursue this larger objective of changing cultural and societal systems. And because psychedelics were so stigmatized still in 2015, it was very difficult to do that without putting yourself at reputational risk. It's a little easier now, but still that's a tremendous issue, which I'll get into in a little bit. So because of that reputational risk, I needed complete independence. So I built up a first business. I was financially independent, not wealthy, but I had enough time and energy to start a website called The Third Wave. And The Third Wave, the focus of it is to help change the cultural conversation around psychedelics. So at the moment, we're the #1 educational resource for safe, structured, and responsible psychedelic use. In other words, we're trying to fill the gap between the clinical and institutional model of psychedelics and eventually where culture must go to fully integrate these substances in a way that's transformative and helpful. So how does that happen, or kind of what's the role of that? So since the 60s, psychedelics have been heavily stigmatized. We've heard about this already, but Nixon's war on drug addicts, peyote used as a drug in Indians' quote-unquote cult of death, LSD horror, right? This was kind of the stigma that resulted from the war on drugs in the 60s. And this is the problem. Today, we still carry around much of that stigma from a cultural perspective. And I think this group in particular, that's not the case. And I see that developing and growing, especially with the recent publication of Michael Pollan's book. But there's still deep stigma that exists in our culture around psychedelics. And to be honest, this stigma then prevents many of us from utilizing the profound benefits of well-intentioned, structured psychedelic use. And so the way that I kind of paint this is psychedelics are simply a tool in a larger toolbox. So there was an author, Stephen Kotler, who wrote a book, Stephen Kotler and Jamie Reel, they wrote a book called Stealing Fire, which showed how people like the Navy SEALs, people in Silicon Valley, transformational festivals like Burning Man, you have a lot of people who attend these who then utilize altered states for peak performance. And what that book did phenomenally well was it made the clear comparison between how psychedelics are actually doing very similar things as meditation, as breath work, fasting, trance states, neurofeedback, et cetera, et cetera. So when we have this toolkit of transformation and of healing, we can merely perceive psychedelics as being one of those tools to help further legitimize them within the cultural conversation. Stealing Fire. So this is some of what we've seen as of late in terms of the positive elements of psychedelics. LSD could make you smarter, happier, and healthier. Should we all try it? People who take psychedelics are less likely to commit violent crimes. LSD is harmonizing for the brain and can change your personality for years. Studies find this is probably linked to the openness study. A woman saved her marriage by microdosing LSD. These are all very positive elements that we've seen as of late. And the reason that we're seeing this is we really pin it down to three main things. First is the recent medicalization and now legalization of cannabis. And cannabis is a tremendous gateway drug in that it familiarizes culture at large with altered states of consciousness that are not alcohol, tobacco, or caffeine. And it specifically familiarizes them with these substances that were previously deemed to be illicit and that we're now realizing have medical value. Cannabis has led the way with that, and now psychedelics is entering in after that. The resurgence of research, which we've heard about a lot here this weekend, and then the abundance of personal testimony. And that's opened a door to a place where we can finally engage in responsible, evidence-based conversation around the use of psychedelics from a cultural perspective. So where does microdosing play into that? And where does our larger mission play into that? So our mission is to change the cultural conversation around psychedelics by A, facilitating research on microdosing. B, providing education. So in other words, how do we increase psychedelic literacy? Because as we look from a transition from the medicalization of psychedelics to the eventual cultural infrastructure that needs to be built so that these altered states can be properly integrated and things don't go crazy like they went in the second wave, we need to increase psychedelic literacy because there is a distinct lack of knowledge still at large about psychedelic substances. And then the third one is building community. And generally, community around psychedelics, but also specifically utilizing microdosing as a touch point for that. So just that we have a full understanding of microdosing, I'm going to briefly explain what that is. So microdosing is basically the consumption of about 1/10 of a regular dose of a psychedelic substances. Most people are microdosing with LSD or psilocybin mushrooms, although you're also seeing it with plant medicines like iboga, ayahuasca, mescaline, peyote, some of these substances as well. And the key to microdosing is not just taking a small amount of a psychedelic, but in fact, it's having a well-structured plan to facilitate and catalyze change in your own life with this substance over usually a 30 to 90-day time period. So for example, one of the primary cultural examples of microdosing is Ayelet Waldman. So Ayelet Waldman wrote a book that was published by Knopf about a year and a half ago. She struggled with suicide, had suicidal ideation, had tried all these different pharmaceuticals, and none had worked. So she started microdosing with LSD for 30 days and then wrote a book about it and talked about how microdosing LSD basically saved her from suicide and significantly helped with her bipolar disorder. So that was the first example. The second example that I can give is my own personal example. So when I first started microdosing, it was in mid-2015. I microdosed 2 times a week with LSD for about 7 months. So it was much longer than your typical protocol, but I basically had no reason to stop, and I was enjoying the benefits as they were, and so I kept going with it. And what I found from that microdosing experience is that it helped with 2 main things. So first of all, it helped with this state of flow. So how many of you are familiar with what a flow state is? Fantastic. So that's exactly what Stephen and Jamie were writing about in Stealing Fire. It's how do these substances like psychedelics, but also breath work, meditation, fasting, initiate a flow state for peak performance. So that was the first thing. I was working on a lot of entrepreneurial projects, and it helped with the creativity element. Now, the second thing it was helpful for was emotional engagement in relationships. So basically, I'm someone who is more introverted. I'm going to go into Myers-Briggs real quick. So I'll do this simple, but I'm an INTP, right? And so N and T means N, I think abstractly. I always think kind of far out. T is I'm very cognitive. I'm not very heart-focused. And so what microdosing helped me to do is really open up emotionally with people in my life to really connect on a heart level rather than just an intellectual level. And so compared to macrodosing, what I found is when I started to talk to people about microdosing, that it's A, much more accessible, that it's B, much less threatening to the ego, largely, and that C, it's easier to integrate into daily life. And so a metaphor for that, I think metaphors are appropriate when we're talking about these sorts of things. When I was speaking to a mentor of mine about the difference between microdosing and macrodosing, he mentioned that, when you take a macrodose, it's like someone is shaking you to get the message. It can be very profound, it can be very insightful, but it can also be very difficult to integrate in the short term because some of these insights that come up are such a 180 from what we're usually dealing with. And so that's when we look at different modalities, for example, like microdosing, where instead of it's someone shaking you to get the message, it's more like a whisper that you can integrate over a time period of 30 to 90 days to help facilitate various insights around your own sense of self, your own sense of well-being, so that you can step into these stages of self-actualization and self-transcendence. In terms of it being more accessible and why that's important. So recent studies show that about 10% of people in the United States have tried psychedelics at some point. And that pales in comparison to something like cannabis, where, again, I don't know the exact stats offhand, but it's likely somewhere from 60 to 70%. So there are much fewer people who have tried psychedelics than cannabis. And that's one distinct difference about the medicalization to the legalization of cannabis compared to psychedelics when we go from the medicalization to the potential legalization of psychedelics. So how do you overcome that barrier? Well, one is obviously all the research that's being done. Two is because of that research, you have people, and Rick emphasized this yesterday, when they're going to these institutes, potentially, and they're getting healing, they're going back to their families, and they're talking about it. But three, the much more, for me, practical, kind of common sense way is just to reduce the barrier to entry. Make it easier for people to start to engage with psychedelic substances in a way that shows profound benefits in healing. And just by lowering that barrier to entry, it's much easier to get people to adopt the fact that psychedelics are a relevant tool to help facilitate transformation and well-being. So how do we do that then? How do we help that adoption stage? Well, we do something called, let's see if it's on here. It's not on here. Hold on. This is the first time I've presented this. We do something called research to facilitate that, right? So we have to prove, obviously, that microdosing has these benefits that we've now heard about in anecdotal reports. So as an overview of where we're at from a microdosing research perspective, Jim Fadiman published a survey with 1,300 people. He presented that material at Psychedelic Science last year, and basically the main takeaway for that was microdosing can help with depression, potentially help with treatment-resistant depression, and, well, we're not really sure for anything else. I've also heard of a recent study that will be published very soon that came out of Toronto that shows that microdosing is helpful for creativity. I'm speaking with people right now who are based out of Vancouver. There's a new institute in Vancouver called the, I believe, British Columbia Center for Substance Use. I believe that's it. And they're looking at starting clinical research with microdosing, potentially to help ADHD, as something to help ADHD. But then we also look at how clinical research could help with depression, PTSD, addiction, some of these other things. So that, again, is the clinical model of psychedelics, which has largely been the focus of research efforts so far. What we're doing is going to be a little different. So really what we're looking at is instead of the 15 to 20% of people who struggle with clinical diagnoses, is how do we build a narrative for the rest of our culture, that's 75 to 80% of people, so they actually understand how microdosing could be useful in an everyday context and situation. So what we're looking at is we're looking at specifically, and we're doing this first by survey-based research. So we have a large community, and basically we're starting to facilitate research by engaging with that community through our online network. And the questions that we're wondering is, what is that relationship between microdosing and autonomy, between microdosing and cognitive flexibility, between microdosing and adaptability, between microdosing and really, how does microdosing help an individual to start to take ownership over their own lives so that they can address the issues that they think are relevant to helping them to live better lives, basically. So that's the research narrative that we're looking to develop with microdosing so that we have relevant information, not particularly for the 20% of people, but really for the larger cultural infrastructure of society. And so how do we do that, right? So this is kind of like the flow of someone who might engage with the topic of microdosing. First, because microdosing, again, is more approachable, there's an interest, right? And they're specifically interested for the betterment of well-being. So what happens is, again, this is specifically for our website. They come in, we use kind of microdosing as that carrot on the stick, right? It's like, how do you get people to start to engage with psychedelic substances? And then by engaging with the topic of microdosing, you put them into a larger ecosystem, which actually helps facilitate education, not only about lower doses, but also about higher doses. Because higher doses, as I said, although they can be more shocking, they also, from my perspective, have the ability to be much more transformative and profound in a short period of time. And so it's then largely about how do you go about doing that. So then you educate about them, and then you get them to participate, right? And they can participate in various things. We've talked about research initiatives and in-person meetups. Then you engage them You continue to engage them with in-person meetups. You continue to engage them with content that's relevant to psychedelic education. And then as they have an excellent experience, as they're learning more about psychedelics, as they become really enthusiastic about how psychedelics are a tool in a larger toolkit to facilitate well-being, then they naturally tell friends and family about that. So this is just some numbers. We've created a community of about 400,000 monthly users, and we have, at this point, about 800 people who have enrolled in, we created like a microdosing course, so that way people who actually want to do this and want to do it in an intentional, optimized way have a resource to make that happen. So we have about 800 people in that. And these are, again, just some basic numbers, which aren't really relevant to this talk. So, a little more context about us and what we've done. Currently the most popular destination. We've received IRB approval for our first psychedelic study, and as I mentioned, are in the process of collaborating on 2 other research projects with well-known organizations in the field. And this is another important element that I haven't emphasized yet, but we've had tremendous success in penetrating mainstream media because of our modern aesthetic and well-researched content. And I think this is a really important element if psychedelics are going to be integrated into modern life. I think generally the psychedelic community has to pay much more attention to how we present ourselves to the larger culture. And I think from my perspective, that means more professionalism, that means more organization, that means like really doing an excellent job so that people take us seriously and not just relying on science and data, because science and data is the first starting point, but really looking at how we go beyond just science and data to creating community that engages people from all elements and walks of life. So for example, with microdosing, what's great about microdosing is it's acting as a touch point for all these people who never really engaged with psychedelic substances before. And those are 3 main groups of people. One is more or less my background, entrepreneurs, people who are consultants, freelance. They're working for themselves, and they're looking at how they can bring more flow states, more creativity into the work that they're doing on a consistent basis. I think 2, within that element as well, is you have people who are, for example, involved in the biohacking scene, who are becoming really interested in microdosing, the self-quantification scene. And then you also have a lot of people who traditionally have been on pharmaceuticals in the past and are now looking at how they can transition into psychedelics and starting with microdosing as that touch point. And so continuing to amplify through mainstream media is one of our larger narratives as well. We're starting to fundraise for a nonprofit. So context on these slides, I'll kind of like explain them a little bit more. This is basically just like a pitch deck that I put together for potential donors. And this helps to give the context and overview of basically what we're doing as an organization. So here are some of our goals, which I touched on briefly already, but I will get back into, of what we're trying to do, again, to integrate psychedelics into the mainstream conversation. So 1, as I mentioned, is launching research. And the first one that we're doing is what is the effect of microdosing on cognitive and behavioral functioning, mood and anxiety, self-efficacy, novelty seeking, and social ability. And I have a researcher who's a PhD student in neuroscience, so she handles a lot of this. So I can answer some questions about the research, but I won't be as familiar as she might be. As we continue to launch research, we're going to reinvest in our website growth. So something that's worked really well for us in terms of how we change this cultural conversation around psychedelics is by looking at how people engage with new information. So, question, when you want to know something new, when you want to learn something new, where's the first place you go if you have a question? Google, absolutely. So 3 years ago, when I started the third wave, if you search for LSD, if you search for MDMA, if you search for psilocybin mushrooms, I believe if you search for DMT, the top things in Google are drug-free websites. So all of a sudden, when you have all these people culturally at large, think on a big, big scale, who are hearing about psychedelics, who maybe hear something positive, and they go and they search for these substances in Google, usually their first point of contact is a prohibitionist propaganda website, right? So that was the initial thing in terms of like, how can we change that? That's why we focused on microdosing, because basically what I saw from a strategic perspective is I knew if we focused on microdosing, because it was entering the cultural zeitgeist, we could get media, which would mean backlinks. Again, this is kind of technical, but when you get backlinks from the New York Times and other major websites, that significantly increases your stock in Google. So all of a sudden, when we write these long-form guides about LSD and psilocybin mushrooms and some of these other substances, when people search for these stuff through Google, when they hear a story from a website, their first point of contact is not a prohibitionist drug propaganda website, but in fact, it's a website that fully supports psychedelic literacy and education and the reintegration of psychedelic substances into our culture. So that's then the website growth element, is how do we continue to amplify that so more and more people have accessible information to science-based research on psychedelics. The next thing is community building. So again, one of my critiques of the current psychedelic space is many local psychedelic societies are not well organized, they do not put on professional events, and they typically, for a lot of things that they do, it's a side gig. It's something that they kind of do in their off time, but we don't have the economic incentive yet for people to actually fully invest in making this a professional activity. So that's a third element, is how do we build nodes in cities across the globe where we actually can pay people to run psychedelic societies so that they can organize events that are professional, that are in nice spaces where we can bring in nice speakers and we can organize that information around, again, the responsible and structured use of psychedelics to facilitate individual well-being, but also collective well-being. So that's then the next element that we're moving into. I'm having conversations right now with people in New York, in LA, potentially Boston, about how specifically we might start third wave nodes in these various places where we can then offer grant money to them to facilitate real community building that's paid for. And then within that is, of course, education. And this gets back to, again, the focal point, is we're looking at how we can increase psychedelic literacy. And these are just kind of what we're going to do with it. Hire full-time staff, launch microdosing research. Year 3, develop a research portfolio, increase online reach, launch PR campaigns. And we're really trying to basically create like a front door entryway for a lot of mainstream people into psychedelics. And why? So this is a quote from Charles Grobe, who has been mentioned a few times. He's a researcher out of UCLA. And he recently wrote a piece online in response to the recent legalization initiative for California. And they're trying to legalize psilocybin by, I believe, 2020. Oregon is trying to do the same. And this was his response to basically a legalization push. For the vast majority of potential users, open access would require an intensive effort to educate a large populace, which remains relatively ignorant of the range of effects of these powerful psychoactive compounds and unaware of critical safety factors, including screening out potential users with serious underlying psychological vulnerabilities, avoiding the concomitant use of other drugs and alcohol, and paying rigorous attention to optimizing the set and setting of the experience. So, on the one hand, what this says to me is, again, education is necessary to build a cultural infrastructure for psychedelics. On the other hand, what this says to me is that microdosing could potentially help with a lot of these critical safety factors. So in other words, when people are taking a much lower amount of a psychedelic, then there's basically less risk involved. So optimizing the set and setting isn't quite as necessary because, again, your altered state is just very, very brief. If we look at avoiding the concomitant use of other drugs and alcohol, I know people who microdose and also potentially smoke cannabis. Again, that's not really a huge issue. So there are a lot of things that microdosing can kind of help when it comes to amplifying this conversation large with potential critical safety factors that might be involved. This is our team, and this is our website. So I think to wrap up, I just want to emphasize a couple things. One is, and these are more questions than anything else that I think are going to be really good for us to meditate on and think about, is with Michael Pollan's new book that's been published, I think one of the concerns is that it may have come out too soon, right? Because we have a culture in society that is so ready for these substances, but we don't yet have the infrastructure necessary for that. So if we look at the model that MAPS has built in terms of, and most of the clinical institutions, where for every one person they have 2 guides, that's not a scalable model in terms of impacting culture at large. So we really have to think about how are we building an infrastructure to potentially support the vision of millions of people doing these substances. And again, microdosing can help with that significantly. I think the second question that's good to meditate on is how do we want psychedelics to be integrated into the mainstream? In other words, do we want it to basically happen like cannabis did, which came with a lot of corporate nonsense? So we're starting to see this in the psychedelic space. And there was, I know, a recent publication that was passed around that was signed by a number of people that was published on Chacruna, be a site organized by Bob Jesse, kind of against that. Or how can we use psychedelics as a way to basically birth, right? Think of the psychedelic renaissance as like a midwife to birth this completely new transformative culture of looking at how everything really is interconnected. But to get people to go from where they are now to step into that, there has to be a lot of work that basically helps people to slowly transition into really fully opening up to the relevance of deep altered states. And again, I think microdosing can help with that process. So I want to thank you for your attention and your time. You've all been a wonderful audience at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning.
Paul.
What's up, Gary?
Very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in your personal experience and those you've seen with others with microdosing. And I guess when I hear about microdosing, to me, in my mind, comes up concerns about dependency and what happens when you then stop. How long? I think you said 7 months. Do you feel a loss or a diminishment after that? And how does that all sort of experience go?
That's a fantastic question. I'm so glad you asked that. So I think one of the things that we emphasize with microdosing from an educational perspective is we really should be using microdosing as a catalyst to integrate better habits over the long term. So I talked about how we want to do research on microdosing for adaptability. In other words, how does microdosing help you to adapt to new situations, to new contexts, to new realities? And how does that map on to adapting a new diet, a new exercise habit, better sleep? How does that map on to integrating a meditation habit, a habit of breath work, right? So we're really looking at, we use microdosing as a tool to catalyze this inertia, this motivation, this momentum. But then within that process, we contextualize habits of self-care that are proven to increase well-being. So for example, we know that like a clinical issue like depression is significantly tied to inflammation. Microdosing, psychedelics are generally anti-inflammatory, as is a diet that is, for example, low in gluten. Fasting helps with inflammation as well. So we really look at how we can then, basically turn off those inflammatory pathways to help people to deal with something like depression. Microdosing is going to be one part of that, but the larger part of that is going to be diet, exercise, and sleep, basically. So does that help to answer your question?
Yeah, so when you stop, do you feel a loss then in the weeks and months afterwards, or do you feel not much of a...
So, great question. So I would say a couple things for that. From my personal experience, the creativity element, the flow state element, there's a drop-off with that. I would say microdosing when I was doing it was really helpful, and then when I stopped, a couple weeks later, it kind of went away. With the emotional connection and resonance and openness, I'd say that stuck around for much longer. So, kind of what, again, this is speculative. We don't have clinical research that proves this, but my assumption is what microdosing is helping with is neuronal plasticity. So there was just recent research that was published that showed that DMT, when applied to rats, helped with creating new dendrites and synapses in the brain. And the shriveling of those dendrites and synapses, a lot of people will think is responsible for addiction and depression. So basically, DMT is a tryptamine, just like psilocybin. So if you're microdosing psilocybin, it's likely something similar is going on in the brain. So how do we utilize that open window of neuronal plasticity and apply it to integrating new habits over the long term so that even when we stop microdosing, those habits are still integrated going forward?
So, check. We got one back here.
Cool.
I'm just curious, what time in the daily routine do you microdose, or would you recommend microdosing in the morning, at night?
Great question. So LSD lasts for about twice as long as psilocybin, typically, and LSD is also more dopaminergic. So it's going to give you more energy, right? So if there's someone who struggles with like anxiety or insomnia, LSD is probably not a good option because it does have that really, really stimulating effect. Psilocybin might be a better option that way. Also, LSD, if you're going to microdose with it, probably best in the morning because it does last so long. I think psilocybin has more flexibility if you do it in the mid-morning or the afternoon. Again, because it's only a 6-hour time window, then as long as you have enough time to wind down before bed at 11 or 12, that would be appropriate, I would assume. I don't know enough about ayahuasca. I've never microdosed ayahuasca. I've only drank ayahuasca twice. So I don't have a lot of context for that. So I can't be of super help. Bia might know a little bit more about that, but I don't. Yeah, can you? That'd be fantastic.
So there's people like in Santo Daime that take small doses of daime, recommended like 4 a.m. There's some treatment in Céu do Mapiá, is the capital forest of the Santo Daime branch of Cefluris. So there is a little bit of that I know of. I wanted to make a comment. And
Please.
Yeah, I just want to disclaim that Paul and I are friends, and he knows that I'm critical to some aspects, but I just feel really uncomfortable with some, parts of your discourse, as you know, and wanted to share and I wanted to hear from you. First, I don't really understand that, you should advocate through psychedelics, through microdoses, because for me, psychedelics is about having strong and impactful experiences. So it doesn't seem like the poster boy is something that has nothing to do with what we're all interested in psychedelics. So I just have a problem with that claim. I think it's your claim and it's your shtick, and I respect that, but I don't find it convincing. I want to make it like for the record because a lot of people don't know a lot about the topic. So I think that that's a claim that it's a belief, but to me it's not convincing, but that's okay. That doesn't bother me. What bothers me is this mission of getting psychedelics mainstream, and I don't know how you people feel about, mainstream culture in the US, but I don't feel happy about that culture. When I've seen ayahuasca getting into mainstream in the US, that is so grotesque, like, it being put in popular vulgar shows in TV and all this dumb celebrities saying all kinds of random bullshit. It makes me so uncomfortable. It makes me sad as a person that's been drinking ayahuasca and researching since the beginning. So I think psychedelics have to do with critical thinking and with questioning mainstream and questioning the establishment. I also don't think that the counterculture was all this bad thing, that now we're all, in bad shape because the counterculture happened. I think the counterculture was great. And it brought civil rights and feminism and all the, God bless the hippies and, the vegetarians and all the freaks out there that changed our lives. That's why we're here today. So I think that, Team Leary screwed it up. No, he didn't. Like, on another scale, he did us a big favor as a society. So, what do you think?
Thank you. So, I'll address the first one, and then I'll address both. So the first one is I like to meet people where they're at. And a lot of people who are not involved in this space, frankly, they are starting to learn about psychedelics. and they understand the scientific benefits and they want to get involved, but because of the ego-dissolving nature of a high-dose experience, they're really intimidated. And they're intimidated specifically of a bad trip or a challenging experience. And the best way to minimize that barrier to entry so that they can have this transformative, profound experience is to get them to engage with it at a lower level initially. And then through that process, start to educate them about how, for example, clinical research shows that high doses can initiate a mystical experience. So in other words, you have to meet people where they're at, or else they won't really start to engage with these substances. So that's number one. Two, I hear your point about mainstream culture, right? And so maybe we should just think about, like, I just go back to, like, we have these tools. We know they're effective when used properly. If people are struggling with issues that we know these can help with, and they don't have the literacy or education to recognize that, it's our duty and responsibility to help facilitate that educational process. And if they choose not to use psychedelics, even if they're educated about it, fine. But I think, like, at least letting them know that it's a tool that's possible to use is really important. And that's just kind of where I stand in it. At the same time, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, totally. Yeah?
Presentations, there's been a reference and research that is complementary.
Sure.
We're going to get you a mic.
In all the other presentations, there's been a reference and complementary data that supports therapy as well as the psychoactive experience.
Right.
Where do you haven't mentioned therapy as part of anything that you've suggested or promoted?
Right.
Talk about that.
So I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a therapist. I'm an entrepreneur. And so when I present things, I present stories. And there's a certain element of that that's important in terms of what are the mechanisms of action that are going on with microdosing and psychedelics. I talked a little bit about the research that we know so far about microdosing, but that's not my forte. That's not my cup of tea. So I have a researcher who handles a lot of that. But as I mentioned, I'm also not interested personally in doing the work on the therapeutic side. I'm really interested in the optimal well-being side. And we're just getting that process started of research. There's really very limited research on that. Jim Fadiman published research in 1966 about the relationship between psychedelics and creativity and problem solving. That's one good reference to look at. Like I said, there's also the recent research that's been published about how DMT can help with neuronal plasticity, which we could then map on to things like adaptability. But there's just a significant lack of research about the non-therapeutic application of psychedelics. And that is kind of what I was laying out today is, like, how can we start that research? What can we do to build that up so that when we look post-medicalization, we can build an infrastructure where not just using it in therapy, but generally at large.
Hey, based on your experience so far, if you had to pick, what would be the ideal long-term rhythm for microdosing? A month on, month off, or 7 months on, 5 off? How does that look like?
So I can tell you just what I've done. So I did it for 7 months, and then I took 4 months off, and then I did it for another 3 months, and then I took 3 to 4 months off. Now I usually just do it before I give talks. And and like if I'm maybe going out in a social situation, I found that when I started microdosing, I basically significantly cut out almost all alcohol use. And so that's also another thing that, like, generally we like to use drugs as humans, and psychedelics, as we know, are the safest, and they're actually medicines in many ways. So that was kind of also, like, helpful for me in doing that. And so, like, to kind of further into your question, I think it just depends on you. I think there are a lot of people who are starting with initial protocols of 3 months, usually 3 to 4 months. And then it's just a matter of, like, journaling and self-reflection and having that awareness of, is this a tool I want to start working with again? Or do I feel comfortable with a habit of meditation, breath work, right? Because, again, we're looking at this as a scale of, we can use these various modalities to facilitate well-being. Microdosing is one of those, but we also have a bunch of others that are effective and useful.
So if you're an entrepreneur
Yeah.
and you're building this new company, you're going to have an exit plan. If we help you build this, what is your exit plan? What are you morally obligated to give back to the community?
Well, this is a nonprofit. So we're basically in the process of incorporating as a nonprofit. And I wouldn't say that's true of all entrepreneurs. Many entrepreneurs, particularly social entrepreneurs, as what I would define myself as I identify with, are people who are really looking at how we can take financial capital and how can we reinvest it in social and ecological capital. So for example, right, one thing of that is like the community idea that I mentioned is how do we basically, so like some of these other ideas, like this isn't my only project, I'm also doing psilocybin retreats in Amsterdam where psilocybin truffles are legal. And we do 3-day and 7-day retreats where we attract people who are middle to upper class. And basically what we're doing is we're using then excess profits and dumping them back into community-oriented work locally in the Netherlands. So there's always this balance between growth and nurturing. And I think that's an important conversation that hasn't happened in the psychedelic community yet because all of the prominent organizations are nonprofit. But that will start to happen in terms of, again, how can we take excess financial capital and reinvest it to rebuild social and ecological capital? And that's a tricky question. That's difficult to do.
Have you felt tolerance building over the 7 months and months of using microdosing?
I would say a little bit. Yeah, I would say a little bit. Have I noticed tolerance building, like a buildup of tolerance after I've microdosed for an extended period of time? I've heard, well, I won't get into that. I've noticed it a little bit. So in other words, there is short-term tolerance. So if you do like 20 mics of LSD on day 1, and you do 20 mics of LSD on day 2, you're not really going to notice on day 2. So that's the short-term element, which is why Jim Fadiman built the protocol of 2 times a week for 5 to 10 weeks. But then the larger element of, like, if you're microdosing for a significant period of time, so twice a week for 7 months, you take some time off, and then, like, you try a high dose, is that going to be as impactful as it was before you started your microdosing regimen? I think that's a really good research question. From my personal experience, I would say that the effects were diminished slightly. But again, I don't know how that maps on to other people's experiences as well. Cool. Great. Thank you all.